All right, we have finished chapter 14, economic transformations, and now I want to take a look back at some of the things that we covered and just some generalizing themes here. Let's start with similarities with the past, but our lives are obviously different. History offers a profound paradox. While we might find many similarities between our life and the past, there are obvious fundamental differences. So how old is globalization? If we look at the history of globalization, we can trace its roots back very far in time. It isn't just a 20th century phenomenon. Early modern globalization was much slower and on a smaller scale. Early modern globalization was not yet centered on Western civilizations. Economic life was mostly pre-industrial, and early modern globalization was tied to empire building and slavery. So that's what's different about globalization today. In today's world, globalization relies on instantaneous communication and rapid transportation, and these were unimaginable in previous eras. Furthermore, the scale of globalization, like I said earlier, has increased dramatically. It was a much smaller scale in the early modern period. And, we must acknowledge the historical connection between empire and slavery and the centuries-long process of globalization. So a study of global commerce in the early modern period shows both how different from and how similar we are to the people of the past. Okay, here we go. Got the right visual source here. Tea and porcelain in Europe. So what foreign trade items can you identify in this image? Tea, porcelain cups, saucers, a teapot, a bowl, maybe the silk tablecloth, perhaps silk clothing on the figures in the painting. So note the European houses on the teacup at the bottom left. What does this indicate about Chinese willingness to cater to the tastes of their European customers? Well, that's a great question. This indicates that Chinese manufacturers were willing to produce patterns specifically for the European market, right? And I think this is fantastic. I love this image because these are they're real, and this is a painting, and you can see the use of these items, or items very similar to that, in the image. So from what social class do you think the woman in the image comes? From what social class? Well, her dress and surroundings indicate that she's most likely from the upper class. She looks very well kept and clean. However, it is possible that she came from a prosperous family engaged in trade, or one of the professions. So not necessarily a member of the upper class, but maybe a wealthy merchant class. How might you explain the great European interest in Chinese products and styles during the 18th century? Why might their possession have suggested that type of status? Well, no European markets could rival the high quality of Chinese porcelain and silk. In addition, Chinese products were more accessible than ever before, and in the 16th and 17th centuries, Chinese products conveyed status because of their expense and relative rarity in Europe. And those products conveyed this type of status because they were expensive, relatively difficult to purchase, and were recognizable as coming from China, and had possessed a reputation for quality. Okay, I love this. A chocolate party in Spain. What marks this event as an upper class occasion? Well, the presence of chocolate, the dress of the participants. The saucers and teacups actually also identify this as an upper class occasion. It's funny because they're doing such an elegant activity on ground. But what steps in the preparation of the chocolate drink can you observe? Well, the processed chocolate beans seem to be represented on the plate in the foreground, right? And the figure to the left is engaged in heating and stirring the chocolate over the fire. And then the person to the right is pouring the chocolate into a cup on a saucer. And the figure in the background holds a filled cup on a saucer, perhaps allowing it to cool before he drinks it. So why do you think Europeans embraced a practice of people they regarded as uncivilized or bloodthirsty or savage? And what does this suggest about the process of cultural borrowing? Well, chocolate lost its Aztec ritual and religious associations in Europe. Instead, it gained a reputation as a medicine or an aphrodisiac and even an energy drink, and the church allowed its consumption during fasts. So, in terms of cultural borrowing, it suggests that products were sometimes adopted without their original cultural contexts, and instead the adopting culture invested the product with different meanings. And that's what took place here. Okay, an Ottoman coffee house. This is busy, lots going on. What activities can you identify in the image? Well, people are drinking coffee. Looks like they're playing some board games, playing music, conversing. We do that now at coffee houses. So would you read this image as critical of the coffee house, celebrating, or maybe as a neutral description? And take note of the musicians and those playing the board games at the bottom, as they're engaged in activities considered disreputable. So how would you describe the general demeanor of the men in the coffee house? Well, you could argue that the image is critical of the coffee house by pointing to the presence of the musicians and those playing the board games and those reputable activities, and even the debates surrounding the status of the coffee house as an intoxicant in the Islamic world. You could also argue that the image is neutral by pointing to the negative features, like the musicians, board games, right, and the coffee itself, but also to the generally positive features, like the high status and the good demeanor and the cleanliness of the patrons. You could also make a case that the image celebrates the coffee house by noting the relaxed social setting, and like I said, the presumably higher status of the participants and their upright demeanor. And, it appears to be one of relaxation and enjoyment. But notice the cups which the patrons are using and those stacked in the upper right-hand corner, or stacked. Right, and then notice their little cups. Do they look similar to those used in Europe and maybe shown in visual source number 1? Well, certainly Ottoman elites by the 16th century preferred Chinese porcelain to that manufactured within their own empire. But the cups do look similar, and they're probably more than likely Chinese porcelain. Okay, and our last image, clothing and status in colonial Mexico. So what indication of status, ambition, or upward mobility can you identify in this image? And keep in mind the status here is associated with race and gender as well as possession of foreign products. Well, indication of status, ambition, or upward mobility include the European dress of the man and the daughter, and the high status native dress of the woman, and even the display of the porcelain in the foreground. And the woman's Native American status may also speak to the ambitions of her husband, who married outside of his own caste. Now, why do you think the woman is shown in more of a traditional regalia while the man is portrayed in European dress? Well, the mode of dress depicted may be meant to emphasize her status as a member of the Native American caste, For one purpose of these paintings was to represent different racial groups. It may also be that she's not the public persona of the family, so she doesn't need to dress with the same pretensions as her husband. But take note of the porcelain items at the bottom right. Where might these have come from? Well, yet again, most likely China. So in what cultural tradition do you think this couple raised their daughter? What problems might they have experienced in this process? Well, so many features of the painting point to ambitions for social mobility. It is likely that they raised a child in a manner even above their own castes. And they may have experienced considerable problems because they sought to secure a status for their child that her racial background did not automatically confer. So, some very interesting things going on in this image. And that sums up entirely Chapter 14, Economic Transformation. I think these 4 images were great at showing cultural blending and a mix and the extent of globalization that developed during the 1450 to 1750. And I will see you guys back for Chapter 15, Cultural Transformations.